Typically, leaner people develop this triad, and the leaner you are, the more intense the triad tends to be. The union of those three markers defines lean mass hyperresponder. It speaks to something called the lipid energy model, but a pure addition of carbs, even along with more saturated fat in the form of Oreo cookies, dropped my cholesterol by 71%, which is actually more effective than statin therapy at lowering my LDL. They're metabolic demonstrations that present uncomfortable findings that create a tension, right? So it's like if you have an unhealthy intervention, be it Oreos or French fries, and a quote good response where LDL goes down, well, there's a paradox there. If there's a paradox, it means there's something that's not being properly understood. Often what will happen in terms of interpretation of stunts, you can call them like that, even if they're peer-reviewed and published, is people will try to layer on an interpretation. Like I'm saying something about high LDL being benign, or about the value of statins, or, about Oreo cookies being healthy even. I'm like, I didn't say any of that. You're layering that on because you're uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance that arises from a lack of understanding on this physiology.
Episode, we share a conversation that I had with Nick Norwitz. I think Nick is one of the best thinkers in the space right now. He's putting out some of the best content. He's an Oxford grad. He's finishing up Harvard Medical School, and he is working on some impressive research as it pertains to what they call lean mass hyperresponders, the lipid energy model, cholesterol, and just so many other things that are tied to health, like irritable bowel disease. Like most great contributors, they've been through something themselves personally, and therefore it sent them out to seek truth and find answers because what they were being told did not add up with what they were experiencing in their own lives. And I think this is how we find truth, and I think this is how we make progress and growth. So be sure to follow Nick because I think he is one of the best thinkers and contributors in the space. Be sure to check him out on Twitter and Instagram. And if you like this type of content, be sure to follow GFit Nutrition. Now let's get on to the interview.
As you said, I had my own experience. I adopted a ketogenic diet for inflammatory bowel disease, quite unexpectedly. I was really having a hard time at the end of college and the beginning of graduate school after moving to the UK. And I was living like in a new country by myself, no contacts, and then end up in like ICU, PAL level care. It's really like a depressing state. And at that point, I was pretty hopeless, hadn't tried much. Had tried a lot, not much had worked. And so I just started, throwing spaghetti at the wall, so to speak. And eventually I got desperate enough to try a ketogenic diet. Lo and behold, it did work for my inflammatory bowel disease. And I did find that I was a lean mass hyperresponder. So on my next lipid panel, my LDL had gone from the low 90s on a mixed diet to well into the 300s at the time, which is quite a dramatic jump, especially because I wasn't really a, carnivore-esque. I was like, fiber and salmon and olive oil and low dairy. So like my plate looked like leafy greens and fish and olive oil. And nevertheless, I was having this very profound response where I had my LDL shoot through the roof as part of what we now know as the lean mass hyperresponder triad, the high LDL, the high HDL, and the low triglycerides, which did provoke questions, especially since I grew up in a medical household. At the time, I'd already been accepted to Harvard Med, so like I had medicine on my mind. I knew what the presumed implications of a lipid panel like mine were, and it just didn't square with everything I'd been taught about physiology and lipid metabolism up until that point. There was just a clear discrepancy between the way I saw myself eating, which was healthy, and what was presumed to be an unhealthy response, the super, super high cholesterol. So that's where my journey started.
Because of your research and because of your involvement with this now, which we'll get into, you're kind of putting out some of the best content, I think. You've done a great job. I've watched you go from like no followers to 20,000. And I know that's not necessarily why you're here, but I think it's because you're putting out good stuff and you're asking great questions. And I think all good science is doing what you and Dave are doing. So let's get into, how did you get involved with specifically that? How'd you get in with Dave? Like, how'd you guys start talking together?
We just came together initially around this phenomenology because we were united by curiosity around this particular phenomenon.
So then Dave started pushing, and you guys have now been published and put out some great work demonstrating a number of things. What is the research? You have a lean mass hyperresponder. Maybe let's explain that to people, what that actually means. I see this a lot. We have a low carb program for people. Pretty much we're trying to detox people from, I would say, sugar, and mainly trying to introduce people to healthy, sustainable habits. And through that, we're doing a low carb lifestyle. So you see some of the things that, you guys talk about all the time, which is why I'm so passionate about what the work you guys are doing, where people, everything in their life improves, everything's better, they feel better, they lose weight, triglycerides drop, all that, HDL's up, and then they have this LDL, and they always come to me with the question of, oh my
Yeah.
God, is this bad? So the lean mass hyperresponder is this lower BMI person who has a high cholesterol response in their LDL. That always gives people fear. This is what motivated, I think, Dave and yourself to now ask these questions. What is it that the research showed and what you guys did? And can you explain that experiment a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, at this point in time, we have 10 papers on the topic out, with many more on the way. And I would say there are two arms to the research around this topic. One is defining the phenotype, which is technically defined by having an LDL above 200 along with an HDL above 80 and triglycerides below 70. The union of those three markers defines lean mass hyperresponder. And then the lean part comes from the association with this triad and leanness. So typically, leaner people develop this triad, and the leaner you are, the more intense the triad tends to be, the higher the LDL tends to be. That's the definition of the phenotype. And part of our research has been understanding why that occurs. What are the drivers of that mechanism? And the other arm is what is the risk associated with those profiles? Because it's very possible for, two things to coexist. One, this could be a totally normal and acutely adaptive metabolic response in human beings, and it could have long-term consequences. So just because we understand the physiology, if and when we do, does not necessarily say anything per se about risk profile. So we have to separate these things, parse them. What's the mechanism? And then what's the risk? With respect to the mechanism, we have several papers on this. It speaks to something called the lipid energy model, which high level, when lean, insulin sensitive people go low carb, they switch from from carb burning to fat burning. And in that fat burning state, their fat cells are releasing fatty acids at a very high rate. And some of those fatty acids need to get recirculated through the liver. So these circulating fatty acids get taken up by the liver, repackaged into the storage form of fat, which is triglycerides. And then the triglycerides get put aboard a shipping container, you can call it, called a VLDL particle, for very low density lipoprotein. That gets shipped out from the liver and then turned over, processed by fat and muscle tissue, where the VLDL containing the triglycerides has the triglycerides sucked out of it, replenishing fat and feeding muscle. So the triglycerides go down. Okay, that's one part of the triad. The VLDL, as the triglycerides go down and are sucked out, shrinks and it becomes an LDL. LDL sticks around longer, so the LDL goes up. That's the other part of the triad. The last part of the triad is the HDL. The HDL increase results because when the VLDL shrinks, if you shrink a sphere as you're decreasing its volume, you also need to decrease its surface area. And there's surface components, including cholesterol, that get taken up by HDL. And so what results is this high LDL, high HDL, low triglyceride triad from this shift to fat burning metabolism. Now, that model is useful because it makes very direct and bold predictions, which can be tested. We've tested it in interventional trials, lots of N=1 studies, and the predictions, even where very counterintuitive, tend to hold true. So for the most basic one is if you add back carbs, you remove the gas pedal on this flywheel and LDL should go down. So if you run with that idea, any carb should work. So we have an interventional trial showing that lean women trending towards this phenotype, you add back carbs, LDL goes down. We have case series showing that. I did my Oreo versus statin trial showing that, where a pure addition, not a swap, but a pure addition of carbs, even along with more saturated fat in the form of Oreo cookies, dropped my cholesterol by 71%. So very dramatic, which is actually more effective than statin therapy at lowering my LDL. So
Can I
that's the
interject?
model as we understand it. Some of the literature. Go ahead.
I did the same thing just by chance. So when I saw your Oreo study, I was so excited, and I did it with French fries.
Okay.
And I bought basic cholesterol testing stuff where I could test myself at home because I was doing it all the time because I was so nerdy about it. A lot of it because of Dave and what you guys are doing. And this was a few years ago, and I added in French fries, and my LDL dropped dramatically.
Yeah.
from adding in French fries. So I just keep continue, but I just want to say that I've seen it myself.
Yeah. So, people have replicated this. It's reproducible. It speaks to the physiology. And again, it's not about presenting a value judgment on LDL or on statins or on these foods per se. But these things that I and I guess you are doing, they're metabolic demonstrations that present uncomfortable findings that create attention, right? So it's like if you have an unhealthy intervention, be it Oreos or French fries, and a quote good response where LDL goes down, well, there's a paradox there. And if there's a paradox, it means there's something that's not being properly understood. So often what will happen in terms of interpretation of stunts, you can call them like that, even if they're peer reviewed and published, is people will try to layer on an interpretation. Like I'm saying something about high LDL being benign, or about the value of statins, or about Oreo cookies being healthy, even. I'm like, I didn't say any of that. You're layering that on because you're uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance that arises from a lack of understanding on this physiology. Which is a very predictable response, and you can kind of play with that for social media purposes and provoking attention towards the literature and the physiology around this incredible phenotype. So, at the other end of the spectrum of the quote hierarchy of literature, we have a meta analysis of 41 human randomized controlled trials, also showing an inverse association between LDL change and BMI. So, again, in human randomized controlled trials, you do the meta analyses. Leaner people on low carb diets are the ones with the increase in the LDL, which is interesting because you would think, again, if this is a quote unhealthy response, why are the healthier people having the quote unhealthy response? So yeah, we've had 10 papers. We're working on our 11th and 12th at the moment on this topic, and it's really gaining a lot of steam, whereby for upcoming projects, we're acquiring more resources, more partnerships. I mean, what people have seen thus far has been very limited in terms of the scope of our resources. Dave did raise about $250,000 for the
Wow, nice.
initial trial, risk trial out of Lundquist, but a lot of basically everything else has been done on, our own dime, very little. The cost of the Oreo versus statin study was the exact cost of 172 Oreos. Sorry, 92 Oreos, 192 Oreos. But and then everything else has been kind of cheap. But like now we're getting to the point where we might be able to acquire millions of dollars to do the kind of studies to really break through the physiology. So people get to see this develop in real time as we're exploring these new ideas.
So let's explain, and I imagine all this ties to the fact that you're saying you add in carbohydrates and the LDL goes down, this lipid energy model.
Yeah.
What implications does that mean on why do you think the mechanism of people that are lean, what are your thoughts based on what you're saying on why does lean people that see this response? And also maybe just explain a little bit of the mechanism why you call it a lipid energy model, and by adding carbs, it's changing
Yeah.
all that.
So the idea, I kind of just spoke to the mechanism a moment ago with the VLDL and the VLDL turnover and all of that. That's the lipid energy model. It's called the lipid energy model because it's
Why does
about
carbs
like,
turn that off though?
hmm?
Why does more carbs turn that off though? Or change?
Because so there's a demand driven process for supplying fuel. And if you don't have carbs as a major fuel, and you can kind of think of at high level the liver's glycogen stores as being a meter for carb availability, at least carb availability to defend blood glucose. Then as that goes up, you can kind of you reduce the pressure on the gas pedal. If you really want to get into technicals, first thing I'll say is, again, early ideas, the precise details aren't being sussed out. But just to give a sense of how these things can be regulated, there was even new data out in Nature, not about the lipid energy model, but just about um, lipid control at the liver. And one of the things they showed is that fatty acids, in addition to being, burned as fuel, they can act as signaling molecules, bind to proteins in the liver to change the expression of, say, fat burning genes and ketone producing genes. So this one study that actually showed that fatty acids bind directly to a protein called AMPK, which affects another protein called MNK, which affects something called EIF4E to change the translatome. How the mRNAs are changed into proteins, that changes the proteome, and the proteome is the collection of proteins that basically controls metabolism in the human body. So mechanistically, there's very clear physiologic plausibility for what could be the regulators here. Now, upstream, sort of upstream, I guess the lipid energy model is a cycle, but the idea when you go low carb and you're shifting to a fat burning metabolism, your fat cells are releasing fatty acids that are then the substrate to go to the liver, be packaged into triglycerides, put aboard the VLDL. The question that I think you were pointing to, which is a good one, is why is this a phenotype that predominates in lean people as opposed to people with higher BMI? Um, the precise details aren't worked out, but we do know that leaner people are better at shifting to a fat burning metabolism when they restrict carbohydrates, probably related to their degree of insulin sensitivity and how well their fat tissue can liberate fatty acids. So if you take a person with insulin resistance and diabetes and a healthy person on a mixed macronutrient diet, the person with diabetes will have higher fatty acid levels. But if you then put them on ketogenic diets or fast them, what will happen is the leaner person will have this massive jump in fatty acids much higher than a person with obesity or type 2 diabetes because they're better at shifting to this fat burning state. Um, their fat cells, you could say, are more flexible, which is actually, if you want to just relate it to modern obesity medicine, also part and parcel of the mechanism of some new obesity drugs. So Mounjaro, for example. Mounjaro is one of these new weight loss drugs, and it's actually more effective than Ozempic. Semaglutide is the generic name. One of the reasons it's more effective, its thought is that the additional component, it's called the chronic GIP agonist, is able to bind to fat cells and increase their ability to liberate fatty acids during a fasting state, which again, analogous to this leaner, more insulin sensitive phenotype where when you restrict carbs, your body does really delve in to fat burning mode. And all the machinery, because you're, quote, metabolically healthy, is able to adaptively, this is what I think, um, reorder itself in order to meet your energy demands when you shift from low carb to, from high carb to low carb. And I'll just add, as people become leaner and more insulin sensitive, this phenotype can emerge in people who were previously insulin resistant. So we have cases, I got an email the other day about a patient, I think the BMI was 43.2. So, well into class 3 obesity. LDL was just genetically low, around 80. They went on a ketogenic diet and started losing weight. Over months to years, they went from a BMI of 43.2 to a BMI under 25. And their LDL was pretty stable until they started to get to that healthy BMI range, at which point their LDL went from the 80s to over 200.
Hmm.
So again, like, pause and think about that. If you're a doctor, put your doctor hat on, you have a patient struggling with diabetes and obesity. They go on a ketogenic diet. They're doing great. Their health is improving across the board. And then they pass this threshold where they actually get to a healthy, quote, healthy weight, at least based on WHO criteria for BMI. And then their LDL goes through the roof without necessarily changing their diet. It's not like as soon as he hit the BMI of 25, he traded all the olive oil in his diet for like butter. You know what I mean?
Right, right, right.
This was a physiologic phenomenon that emerged once, presumably, it's extrapolating from BMI. BMI is not perfect, but a healthier body composition and better metabolic health state was reached. That is really interesting.
Now, does any of it, this may be a really dumb question. Does any of it have to do with a person being in a quote overfed state versus I don't have as much energy on my body? So now, does anything within the metabolism or the mechanism there change from being someone who has plenty of excess energy on their body versus not? Or no, that has nothing to do with it at all. There's no way mechanistically that could matter.
Oh, I would never, very rarely would I say no way mechanistically could that matter. I think thinking high level, one could say that in a person with, so with fat cells, there's something called hyperplasia, where you get more fat cells, and hypertrophy, where the fat cells get bigger. Generally, you want small fat cells. That's just a healthier phenotype. So one could argue that having smaller fat cells, or something about the small fat cells where it's producing a signal that it wants more, let's say, replenishment. And so it helps upregulate and kind of pull the lipid energy model forward. I
Okay.
think that's physiologically possible. Um, so yeah.
And
On
I
that
only,
note, actually, there was just a study that came out about exercise, which is
Mhm.
related to the lipid energy model because it's exercise, changing fat cell morphology even when there wasn't a difference in fat mass. So it was a cross-sectional study, admittedly, but they took people who were chronic exercisers and matched them to people who were sedentary, but who had the exact same percent body fat and total body fat. And what they actually found was that the fat cells in the people who were exercisers, even though there was just as much fat, they had more capillary density, so more blood vessels going to them, less of a type of collagen, I think it was col 6A, which is associated with metabolic syndrome, and overall better lipogenic capacity. Like they were different fat physiology despite having the same fat. So these things can get quite complicated, which is why I never say never. Um, so it was a good question. That's my
Yeah, and
my
I only ask it because of me and my wife do a bunch of experiments and of one type of things, and we did a one time an alternate day fasting one and an OMAD. She did OMAD, I
yeah.
did alternate day fasting, and we did body scans and all that. And we're both very lean, we're both very active. We have a CrossFit gym, and we found that she lost a ton of muscle mass, whereas with other things I've done with other people, I've seen people that are overweight respond differently to something more like an extreme fasting or even low carb or keto
Right.
versus someone who's hyperactive, very lean already, can have a different response because, and sometimes I just think of like the stress response on the body of someone who has energy available versus someone who's already pretty lean. Once again, I don't know if that makes sense. It's just what I see anecdotally in working with people that people can have different responses to different diets,
Absolutely.
being
Absolutely.
overfed or underfed.
Yeah.
Now, you did a study recently, another personal experiment where you ate eggs every hour for how long was it?
It was a month. I did 720 eggs. So 720 came from an average of one egg per hour every hour for a month.
And
But that was catchy. Obviously, I did sleep, so I'm averaging out here. But
you're a good marketer, dude, to bringing attention to it because it's a great experiment and it's good.
you saw Vital Farms reply. So I
Yeah,
used
I saw
Vital
it. Yeah,
Farm eggs. The day after, they're like, "We love this. We're giving you free eggs for a year."
that's amazing.
Which is going to be like 8,000 eggs.
Yeah.
But I'll take it. So this wasn't a conflict of interest. I had no, and I did not expect them to give me free eggs for a year. But yeah. So again, it's just a metabolic demonstration, where I ate a ton of eggs, and yeah, I for the first 2 weeks my LDL did not change. I wanted to use this as a teaching tool with respect to new mechanisms around or newly discovered mechanisms around how cholesterol is regulated when you have more cholesterol intake. So there's a newly discovered hormone called cholesin, which was discovered published in a paper in on a Cell Press journals 2024, so very recent. And basically, the idea is when you eat dietary cholesterol, this hormone is increased and it tells your liver to stop making more cholesterol. You eat less cholesterol, this hormone goes down, taking the brakes on cholesterol synthesis from the liver. It's a name cholesin for cholesterol inhibitor. Actually makes a lot of
Okay.
sense. So I ate a bunch of eggs. Cholesterol was not changing. And then I added in carbs in the form of just some fruit. And I was able to tank my LDL while eating all these eggs, which again, physiologic demonstration of we have this push pull, the idea of egg yolks being super dense in cholesterol. Like I was eating so much cholesterol that you could actually measure the mass of cholesterol in kilograms of cholesterol. About 0.13 something kilos of cholesterol. Like I was eating a lot of eggs and a lot of cholesterol. You balance that off against principles of the lipid energy model, adding back just some carbs, and the lipid energy model in a particular metabolic context wins. So yeah, I was surprised by how well people responded to it. That was what you alluded to. I just got on Instagram. I'm like there for 3 months, and I just been kind of like doing not much, but I had 10,000 followers, and like the next day I had 20,000 because people like eggs, I guess. Instagram is definitely my smallest social. I'm more active on X and YouTube, which are also growing nicely. But yeah, Instagram replied very strongly to my egg reel. So
But you put out thought-provoking things that are actually intelligent, not just like a bozo jumping around to get attention. So I think it's quickly and also the low carb keto dietary community on there is so passionate.
yeah,
And in some weird way, obviously people are going to take you as someone who's like looking out for their best interests, but
it's tricky because you know me by you do well enough to know like I want to sit down for 5 hour podcasts. I have. I want to get into the nitty gritty of cell metabolism, nature, science. Like that is
yep.
what I'm an academician. I love to explain those things and I love teaching. You go to Instagram and like you kind of have to play the game a little bit, which if you don't get to, or if you don't know someone, like on the surface, it can seem very gimmicky. So it's a difficult thing. It really is because I mean, I have fun with the egg thing, but like I watch the egg reel. Like I have 90 seconds to make a point that's going to resonate with people. The idea is not to teach them everything they need to know in 90 seconds, but get them interested enough to then look at the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So you'll fold in, like I had one this morning about lactylation in the medial
I sort of,
prefrontal
yeah.
cortex and anxiety. It's like this is based on really cool new data, but if I say those words, lactylation of SNAP91 in the medial prefrontal cortex, do you think that's going to get any shares? So yeah, I play a little bit, and I'm gonna, on the egg video, I think people like the idea of me having. I covered my queen bed in just cartons of eggs. That was the hook, and it evidently worked. So things to play with. It's a
But it's good
game.
because you have the substance, though. Once you get the attention and you have the substance, and that's smart. It's, it's a great job of bringing attention to some of these things, and you're doing good work. I think asking the right questions, so it's pretty cool, and you have the know how to do it. You're like Harvard Medical School. I even seen you interviewed. Who's the He's been there forever. Big part of the
Really?
research. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So like people think about this thing as like, oh, they see social media, it's all tribal to carnivores and the vegans and keto and calories. In the academic sphere, so for context, Walter Willett's probably one of the most cited nutrition researchers in history. H-index of something like 350. He's at the Harvard Chan School. And let's just say, for people who aren't in the know on this, people would presume I'm at a polar opposite end of him in terms of my philosophies on nutrition. And we don't see everything eye to eye. But that doesn't preclude us sitting down. He invited me to his house and we did an interview, which was a lot of fun. And he was super lovely and like in person is quite a, I think thoughtful and nuanced individual. So be it him or be it me, caricatures get made of people that get propagated in spaces that are beyond their own quote camp. So I know like calorie and plant-based communities have caricatures of me that are not accurate. They get created because it's good to have a villain and other a scapegoat in order to build one's following. It's just the way I don't take it personally. It's the way things are. So it's something like if you're gonna be public, be it like on social media or just a high profile person in general, like this is going to happen. You need to I'm paraphrasing a famous Stanford neuroscience here, but like the art of being misunderstood and being okay with it is something that you need to, contend with if you're going to have longevity with any degree of public presence, especially in the nutrition space, I think.
well, to that point, I think what you're trying to prove, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're trying to show, and at least to the common person, someone who's not nerding out on nutrition, is the societal belief that maybe cholesterol always implies risk, always implies problems. It's always there for the wrong reasons. Whereas you're showing with the lipid energy model, there may be other reasons or mechanisms for why this is here. It may or may not be risky. And with that, is that what you're trying to show? And then also, what is your takeaways on the risk of LDL? Where do you stand? You're a smart dude. You have a lot of
Yeah.
experience looking this. You're dedicating your work to it. So what is your take on it right now as you see
Yeah.
it?
I think what I'm trying to get people to do is be willing to have difficult discussions about the limits of knowledge in the literature and ask the right questions. So questions like, are lean mass hyperresponders at increased risk for cardiovascular disease? And if so, what is the absolute risk? That is the right question. That is a hard question. It is a totally fair question. It's very different than the extreme claims some people make about absolutely no risk or no association between things like LDL ApoB and cardiovascular risk, which I don't say. But it's still fair to present the question. So my goals are to get people to ask legitimate questions because the science is not settled on these matters. And I think things like LDL, ApoB, cholesterol, they all need to be taken in a particular context. The risk associated with these markers is context dependent. That should not be a controversial statement. And I think there are oversimplifications on both sides. On the more conventional side, statements like lower is better. When it comes to LDL and ApoB, what I'd say to that is like, well, with respect to what? And how are you lowering it? Like, is it better with respect to just cardiovascular disease, overall health? And what are the trade-offs of any given intervention in any given person? Those are questions that any clinician should ask at an individual level when we get into public spaces, I think there's fear about introducing nuance because it could be misunderstood, and some people could take that as license to do dangerous things. That is my steel man for why I think there's a lot of lack of nuance on the conservative end of things. But what I'd say to that is I think you actually risk more by trying to avoid the nuance and the hard questions about risks associated with interventions, unknowns with respect to risk in like lean mass hyperresponders, because people, even if they're not medically educated or scientifically trained, are smart enough to know when you're patronizing to them, and then they get upset and rebel. And I think that's when dangerous behavior patterns manifest, not when you just take the time to try to explain, here's what we know, here's what we don't. And here are the questions that we as academicians, as doctors or doctors to be, are asking now that are pertinent to the development of our understanding of physiology and medicine, as might be important to you either for curiosity purposes or direct medical purposes.
So with that, you actually live a ketogenic lifestyle, correct?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, and if I understand correctly, it's been 5 years roughly for the most part within your life.
Yeah. 5 years, and I guess this is September 2024. So 5 years, 3-ish months.
So where is your LDL and your cholesterol at this stage in your life? And you're managing your risk in that, right? You're making that decision because you are doing it, obviously, you said for initially you've done that because of
Ulcerative colitis. Yeah.
also colitis issues with that. So you're still continuing to live that way because of that?
Yes. Indeed. My LDL bounces around the high 300s and the low 500s.
Okay. And then where are you in your headspace with that? Is that why you're doing this research? It's to find this out. You continue to, in theory, to the
Yeah.
traditional research, take that risk. Um,
It's provoked my curiosity. I am not reassured entirely. I am reassured by the fact that on scans, even after years of having these levels, I don't have any observable plaque, even on CT angiography. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be some like extraluminal accumulation that hasn't manifested, this, that, or the other. The way I think about it is, again, just talking about my needs and my priorities is one, ketogenic diet's a non-negotiable. It allows me to have a quality of life and engage in life where the alternative would not. Two, I have, quote, buffer room. Like if there's no observable plaque and none has developed after years of exposure for me, then it's not going to be a jack in the box phenomenon, right? And so I can continue to monitor and observe. Another thing to consider, I'm not going to get into all the nitty gritty, but I have, even beyond the ulcerative colitis, other medical considerations and qualms about lifelong, say, pharmacotherapy. And I've looked at all the drugs, including bempedoic acid, Zetia, PCSK9 inhibitors, statins. A couple of them I've even tried. Some have had negative side effects as a result of trying them. And with all the personal considerations, I've come to the point of I'm going to watch and wait and learn with an open mind and adjust my personal decisions with new data emerging. I do have an unfair advantage in that I have access to data that even aren't published yet, which I have, people can read between the lines on this what they want, but I have personally found reassuring. I don't mean to be a tease there. I just mean to be fully transparent about, you asked where my headspace was at and
yeah.
what factors I'm considering. And, those things weigh into my decisions. For example, and this isn't the case, but if I had access to data that we hadn't published that, oh, actually, LMHRs were getting like heart attacks left and right, of course that would influence my decision. So the
Right.
converse of that can also be true. And people will have to wait for the data to become public to learn more about that.
Well, as someone who I consider an expert in the low carb space, and like I said, dedicating your work to this, I wanted to move into some of the topics related to that low carbohydrate lifestyle and some of the things that you do see
Yeah.
who it benefits. First, I would like to start with what you deal with yourself. I always try to help people working with the general population in our gyms or people doing our nutrition programs. So you're trying to solve their symptoms and help them with their health risk factors. One of the biggest ones is exactly what you deal with. So what is it? What's the research show? in regards to IBS and some of the things that you mentioned?
Yeah. First thing is often gets confused, but to distinguish between irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and then inflammatory bowel diseases, which include ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. IBS is basically like you get diarrhea, constipation, or you can have a mixed profile. It's symptomatic, but there's not necessarily anything on inspection. So if you go in and do a colonoscopy, the colon will look like normal, for example, versus Crohn's and colitis, where you can actually go in and see, say, an ulcerative colitis like ulcers in the colon. And you bleed out of those. It can be incredibly painful, really life upending. Those are important to distinguish because one is a more clear pathophysiology, the inflammatory bowel diseases. IBS is a little bit more of like a fluffy symptomatic syndrome. It doesn't mean it's not real. It just
Right.
means studying it is different. Anyway, on the inflammatory bowel disease side of the fence, I would say there are not really good, rigorous trials for high intensity dietary therapy for the treatment of IBDs. So they just haven't really been conducted. There are some kind of, I think, not so great trials on things like low FODMAP diet, specific carbohydrate that let's just say I think that there is better biological plausibility to think that more intense dietary interventions, including elimination diets, ketogenic and carnivore, would have more efficacy. And those diets haven't been rigorously explored in the literature. Doesn't mean they can't work. They can be the most effective thing in the world. If you haven't done the trial to properly ask the question, it's not going to result in it being standard of care. So I don't want people to mistake the idea of we don't, quote, have evidence to make the standard of care with the idea that diet doesn't treat inflammatory bowel disease. In fact, for a lot of people, it seems to help very much. We have a lot of people saying that they went keto or carnivore and basically, this is their words, but cured severe inflammatory bowel disease, either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. That it was like another lifetime when they had the disease versus when they changed their diet. So, as a case in point, we collected 10 of these medical case reports, compiled them into a case series, published it recently in Frontiers in Nutrition, just speaking to people who had a severe history of inflammatory bowel disease, people who have been on multiple, immunomodulatory therapies, maybe have had surgery to have part of their small intestines removed for Crohn's disease, like really severe cases, all of whom went into remission, clinical remission on, in this case, carnivore style ketogenic diet. You can look up the paper. It's not hard to find, and they speak to their stories. We also go through their medical histories, including diagnosis of histologically confirmed inflammatory bowel disease, and quantify their clinical improvement. Again, everybody went into complete remission and are off all medications for IBDs. So these are powerful stories. They are self-selected. This is a case series. They are stories, but when you combine that with the biological plausibility for how this would work. So ketones, for example, they're anti-inflammatory, and higher ketone levels in the gut correlate with lower IBD activity in people with IBD. Ketones regulate the NLRP3 inflammasome. Ketones regulate the stem cell niche in the gut. There has been data showing that fiber elimination in the case of carnivore diet, or with respect related to carnivore diet, fiber elimination has been shown to be therapeutic in pediatric Crohn's disease because it changes microbiome metabolism and particularly the metabolism of this mucospirillum pathobiont. Lots of big words there. Big words aren't important. The point is, when you have accumulating clinical narratives, powerful clinical narratives of real human beings combined and framed with by physiological mechanisms to explain how this might work, I think there's something there. The fact of the matter is that the human randomized control trials that will be, very expensive to conduct just have not been done because of the incentive structure of the research ecosystem. I and colleagues are trying to get them done, but it's not an easy thing to do. So they just haven't been done yet.
I think a lot of people, sometimes people that will come to work with me will be following the typical dietary advice and almost leaning into it harder, more fiber, more plants, more greens. And I'm someone that is a low carb, higher fat, good amount of protein. I eat plants, I eat lots of meat. I kind of blend it all in.
Mm.
But for those people, they seem to lean into it harder, and I think it doesn't serve them well. So I think people get very phobic of not including fiber. What you brought up some stuff about fiber. What do you know about fiber, and how do ketones in any way replace what in theory fiber does in as far as feeding the health of the intestinal lining?
A few things. One, I think I would separate the therapeutic effects of, say, a ketogenic diet and fiber elimination potentially in inflammatory bowel disease from any potential health benefits that the general public could get from fiber. Again, it's intervention in a context. So at population scale, I do believe that fiber and particular sorts of fibers can have benefits through effects on the microbiome, production of short chain fatty acids, all of that. I would say in the case of inflammatory bowel disease, in the end, it's what works best for you. I do think fiber elimination in the context of even a carnivore diet has potential for therapeutic efficacy. Again, in that use case, more remains to be explored. In terms of fiber, it's interesting because I think people like to put their, stake in the ground and say it's either good or bad. The fact of the matter is there are data showing that in some people, fiber is inflammatory, and other people it's anti-inflammatory. That's just one outcome metric of, quote, good or bad. But point is, we have different responses to dietary interventions, including fiber, depending on who we are as a host and our microbiome composition. As I said, I mentioned some literature earlier that I think in a particular context, say inflammatory bowel disease, fiber elimination, especially in the context of a ketogenic diet, might be therapeutic. That doesn't translate to broad population health benefits. I think for your average person, eating a diet inclusive of more higher fiber options would probably yield, again, on average, better outcomes, but I don't think fiber is necessary. In fact, it physiologically is not necessary. Um, so some people who choose to adopt lower fiber carnivore diets experience tremendous health benefits. And I think that is, not something to be brushed aside for those who are experiencing health benefits with that sort of intervention. I have questions and concerns. I think just because it's unknown, what are the long-term consequences of that? Even in myself, am I trading something in the way of certain elements of optimum long-term health or gut health from being on a typically lower fiber diet to treat my inflammatory bowel disease potentially? For me, it's a worthy trade-off because it allows me to better treat what I need to treat in the everyday. But long term, I don't know. You did ask ketone bodies potentially supplant some of the functions of fiber. I mean, beta hydroxybutyrate and butyrate, a short chain fatty acid made by the gut microbiome, generally from fiber, do have overlapping receptors. It's not a perfect overlap, so I'm not going to say it's going to perfectly recapitulate the metabolic effects of fibers. But again, this is in the realm of unknown. People cannot say with confidence that fiber is going to have irreplaceable health benefits, nor can people say that fiber elimination is 100% not going to have, health consequences. These are just in the elements of the unknown because we haven't tested it. So it comes down to the individual level. What are you able to tolerate? And what does changing fiber intake look like for you day in and day out? Like, does that mean you're, not supplementing fiber, or does it mean you're like avoiding things like berries and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and, you know, just speaking to my own experience, if I didn't have to deal with the gut issues that I have, at least a history for, I would love to have like a pan of roasted Brussels and bacon and walnuts. Like it's delicious. I think it's nutritious, and I would not want to scare people away from eating higher fiber foods if they're able to tolerate it and they might exert benefits. But if for whatever reason you find you do better on a low fiber diet, then that's your N equals one experience, and I'd listen to that as well.
So the last thing that I really wanted to get into with you was I've seen you do a lot of stuff and you hear a lot of guys, a lot of popular guys. I've even seen you make some memes on it that talk about calories in, calories out. Personally, I work with people, so I feel it is a lot more than that. I think it's an important component, calories. But what does any research say that you know of, and I think you've even brought up in the past, of why a low carb approach could be beneficial, possibly hormonally or mechanistically, for someone that may have their body locked in a place where maybe it is struggle to use and liberate fat or things like that. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah. First thing is, I say calories don't cause obesity, and I stand by that. But I would differentiate that from the statement calories don't matter. Those are two distinct things, and the distinction is in the word cause. Cause, at least in my opinion, speaks to physiology and biology and what are the biological drivers of, in this case, obesity. And the answer is not energy balance. That's just a statement of physics which can hold even if calories are a downstream consequence, or let's say calorie balance is a downstream consequence of something more important upstream. Calorie, the calorie equation can still hold. So the way I think about it, as encapsulated in a beautiful piece in Obesity, I think it was entitled Trapped Fat, is it's about how your body partitions the energy you take in. If it puts it in energy expenditure, be that changes in body heat production, heart rate, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, things that aren't in the conscious, or it stores it in lean tissue and builds up lean tissue, which would increase your basal metabolic rate, or it stores it in fat. Your body has energy that you derive from foods that we can measure as calories, and then it decides what to do with that. And then downstream of that are the consequences of things like increased hunger, decreased energy expenditure. So I think it's about, broadly speaking, optimizing your hormonal milieu in your body to optimize that process so that calorie balance falls into place, rather than looking at calories as the lever you want to pull. And high level, if you look at the interventional data, typically you find what would be considered paradoxes under a calorie-centric mindset. So where a lot of high-calorie foods, for example, associate with decreased weight or even interventional trials of weight loss. One example that's my favorite, just because my favorite nut, macadamia, like the highest calorie nut, super high fat. I'm aware of one interventional trial where they just said eat more macadamia. And over 1 month, their BMI went down significantly. That butts against the conventional calories in, calories out approach. It doesn't mean calories don't matter per se. It just means they're not, I think, an adaptive clinical thing to focus on as your primary lever. Now, speaking about the physiology of low carb diets, there are data, including human randomized control trial data, saying that there is a metabolic advantage to going on a low carb diet, particularly among those who are insulin resistant. So, for example, in one trial that was published in the BMJ in 2018, they took people, it was a 5 months randomized control trial where after weight loss, people were randomized to different diets that had the same percent protein, 20%, and either 20% fat, 40% fat, or 60% fat, the rest being made up by carbs. And in addition, the diets were actually built of the same foods, just in different proportions. So it was very rigorously done. And what they did quite nicely is clamped weight. So basically, they adjusted energy intake in order to force weight to be stable. What's nice about this is if you have a 5 month trial, you can't keep people in a metabolic ward. You just can't do it. And so you're not going to be able to accurately measure calories, but you could measure what would be, by the calorie in, calories out mindset's own logic, the direct consequence of that, which is weight. And so if you clamp a weight, then what you can do is see, is the body compensating by changing energy expenditure? And what they found was in the low carb diets, people had to expend like 200 plus more calories had to eat 200 plus more calories to maintain the same weight, showing that there is a thermodynamic advantage of the macronutrient profile of the diet. Now, even that diet wasn't ketogenic. Could there be additional benefits of ketogenic diets, for example? And the answer is yes. There are even new data showing that basically ketones and ketogenic diets can increase fecal excretion of calories, basically pooping out calories. The way that has to work is with changes in the microbiome where certain bile acids, in this case, taurine conjugated bile acids, go up. And it increases the release of calories from your poo. Again, you could encapsulate this in a calorie balance equation, but
Right.
practically, clinically, it's like people aren't going and like, oh, but did you measure the calories in your poo? Absolutely not. So what is it adaptive to focus on? I think we can go through a litany of mechanisms. That is just literally one of many. But the idea is there are more adaptive things to focus on than calories. Calorie balance holds, but it's a consequence, not the cause, not the driver, so to speak.
personally feel like sometimes people dismiss when they talk about this conversation, the behavioral implications of the types of foods that you eat and the way they can trigger
Yeah.
behaviors within the body and how you eat and hunger control and things like that.
Yeah. Well, you can see how that sets up a vicious cycle, right? So going back to this idea of fuel partitioning, if I have this model where I'm saying, okay, if your body chooses to take the energy it has and partition it more in fat tissue, and the consequence of that later is a relative energy deficit in the blood and increased hunger and decreased energy expenditure. What we're doing is we're putting energy intake downstream, but we are saying as a consequence of this, there's more hunger, so you might eat more. But what do people do when they're craving food?
Right.
You know, like after they've had some car, they generally go back for like the midnight cake, you know? They're
Right.
going to binge on the ice cream and the cake. What's that going to do? It's going to spike their insulin and put their body in a state where, again, it's going to store more energy in fat tissue, all things being equal. It constructs the hormonal milieu to then have more maladaptive fuel partitioning. So then you get hungry later, then you binge on more cake, and you have this vicious cycle, which, yes, includes human behavior as a component. But human behavior stems from physiology, both central, neurometabolism, but also peripheral. The effects that fat cells have, upstream on your brain and consequently your behavior. So it's not a matter of willpower, if willpower is even a thing, because our choices, at least I believe, people might feel free to contradict me, but are a direct manifestation of our underlying physiology and metabolism. And we need to accept that if we're going to give people, adaptive and helpful tools in order to maintain their weight, optimize their body composition, beyond just saying it's willpower and it's calorie imbalance, and you need to figure out some way to get things in balance. Because that, frankly, is not helpful.
I want to pretty much leave that there or wrap that up because I've taken up so much of your time. But I do have one nerdy question personally. And if you can't answer it or don't want to answer it, it's all good. We can get into it another day because I want to let you go here.
Shoot.
My son had a seizure disorder when he was 2 or 3 years old. It's actually what introduced me to keto and some of these things. And there's so many other topics I would love to get into with you one day. It's like as far as cancer and stuff like that. I was lucky enough to interview Thomas Seyfried one time. So all the mechanisms there, because that comes up a lot. Do they ever know why fasting or a ketogenic diet is calming to a brain? Is there any understanding to that any further?
Calming to a brain is interesting because there's different ways in which a brain can be, let's say, I mean, the opposite of calming is hyperactive. It could be a seizure disorder, it could be bipolar mania. And it's been shown that ketogenic diets can be therapeutic for both. Obviously, epilepsy was the first clinical use case for ketogenic diets. And what I would say is the effects are likely multitudinous. There's probably direct effects of changes in neurotransmission, so increases in a neurotransmitter called GABA, which is the primary relaxing neurotransmitter in the brain. So rebalancing those circuits. There could be effects on how neurons wire together. There are probably effects on the effects of ketogenic diets on non-ketone dependent mechanisms, potentially via the microbiome. So there are some preclinical data showing that the microbiome is necessary for the anti-epileptic effects of seizures. I don't know if that applies to all human cases, but the thing about a metabolic intervention like a ketogenic diet is it's going to have a plethora of effects. And in any given individual, different effects could have different therapeutic weights.
Well, what do you have coming up? I see you have a number of different things. You're now bumping elbows with some of the best people. You have something with Dom, I believe, coming up soon.
We had a Q&A recently. Yeah, I have a lot of things in the
That was
works.
in the past. You're right. Jesus, time's
Yeah,
flying.
yeah. I know time's flying. I know it's nice to get around. There are people that, like, for example, I've known of for a long time that I've had pen pal relationships with, like Thomas DeLauer, who, for reasons of medical school commitments, I haven't been able to make it out. We were able to make it out to the West Coast recently, chat with him and other people. So now I'm just kind of getting my feet wet in terms of really getting to know and network people in this space, and it's been a true pleasure. So.
Awesome, man. Where can we follow you?
Nick Norwitz, NickNorwitz on any social. Twitter and YouTube are my biggest. Instagram is growing quickly, but also people like Facebook threads. You can find me wherever, and there are not many Nick Norwitzes in the world, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. What I appreciate your time. Look forward to all the things you're going to do, and hopefully I get the opportunity to speak to you again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it, Nick.
Thanks.